expanded reproduction. It's a first cut, a first approximation, which is quite one-sided and it's static in terms of the transformation. Now, the consequence of the transformation is the formation of a general rate of profit. And that's what's explained in part 3 of volume 3. Okay, so what we have is the dynamic really is introduced by Marx in part 3. Okay, so what we have is a contradictory movement in the totality of capital, where once the general rate of profit is seen to be formed, it's also seen to be the bearer of an inherent contradiction, which is as the productivity of labor increases, so the rate of profit will fall. So this sort of unity of these first 3 parts is a illustration of the type of architecture Marx employs, where he starts with a real contradiction, which is at the level of an individual capital, and he moves it up to sector level, and then he moves it into a contradiction for the system as a whole. So it's a point I'm sort of emphasizing. Much of the literature tends to look at parts 2 and 3 of volume 3 in isolation. And one of the points of my argument is you really have to understand the premise of the problem, the posing of the problem in part 1 of volume 3. Okay, now taking a slight step back, I'm just going to remind everybody of the sort of the basic concepts which we're using, drawing from volume 1, just to make sure that we can follow the discussion as it develops. So Marx uses the term variable capital for that capital which is in the form of labor power. He will take a typical example, which we will refer to quite a lot, say 20 money units. This is say 20 million pounds, okay? He refers to content capital as that capital which is included in the final commodity value, but stems from raw materials, machines, buildings, etc. And so the 2 of these elements are refigured into the commodity. Their value reappears in the commodity form as C plus V. For Marx, surplus value is the new value which is created by labor in its expression during the working day or the working period, which is over and above the equivalent for the wage. And this he normally uses S for. Okay, so we have the value of the commodity product is C plus V plus S. And the rate of surplus value in the capitalist system expresses a degree of exploitation of the working class. And in our example, that would be a rate of exploitation, a rate of surplus value of 100%. Now, one concept we didn't discuss, but is very crucial to volume 1, is Marx's concept of the organic composition of capital. And what he means by this is the ratio in value terms of constant to variable capital. So you can imagine as industrial sectors become mechanized and develop technologies, then more and more money is spent on the machinery than is spent on wages to buy the labor power. So what you have is, as the technical productivity of labor increases, you have to a correlatory degree an increase in the value spent on machines as distinct and on raw materials as distinct from that which is spent on labor power. Marx typically uses a ratio of 4 to 1 on the sort of figures we've just been using. Okay, so in other words, a capital of 100 would spend 80 on constant capital, spend 20 on variable capital, wages, and so the ratio of this organic composition, which is an internal ratio, internal to the composition of capital, would be 4 to 1. And I want to move on to, this is going to be like Shakespeare in 50 seconds sort of thing. I'm going to move on to volume 2 and what the important concepts from volume 2 that apply in volume 3. And in this, I'm slightly against the grain of the literature. In my opinion, a lot of literature made quite a big mistake which is they look to the last of these three bubbles to the right, which is the reproduction and circulation of total social capital, otherwise known as departments of production. In actual fact, in volume 3, the unit of analysis is not departments of production, it's sectors of production, which are different. But in developing that analysis, Marx draws heavily on the concepts he brought out in consideration of the movement of an individual capital, which is the middle part of volume 2. So he starts off with an individual capital, and the form of capital changes. It starts as money. It's then invested in the commodities with which capital produces. Production takes place, and then commodities are sold. So on the left-hand side, we can see a sort of circulatory movement of capital going through these different forms as it performs its different functions. Marx emphasizes this. He takes each element in turn. We know how rigorous and systematic he is, but he always thinks of these elements as units within a moving whole. Now, this means that he's bringing in time. The time dimension is part of the analysis. And in the middle section, this really becomes the focus of the analysis, where he looks at how time affects the internal subdivisions or movements of elements of capital. The first of these is the distinction between fixed and circulating capital. Now, this distinction is often confused with constant and variable capital, but it's not. It's a much more visible and external distinction of categories of capital, which operating capitalists are very familiar with, whereas they would in general either not be familiar with or deny variable versus constant capital. Now, circulating capital is used up in the production of commodities as they are being produced. So we're talking about raw materials, we're talking about ancillary materials and things such as lighting. So as the commodities get produced, so there are various inputs to their production which are immediately expressed as in the form, in their finished form. Now, generally speaking, waged labor also fits into this category. In other words, waged labor is both variable capital, it's the source of new surplus value, and it's circulating capital. It is used up and its value is passed over in toto into the value of the commodities produced. Now, in distinction to this, and it's a fairly sort of it's a very intuitively graspable idea, there are elements of the capital invested which retain their value for longer than one production cycle. So machines typically might last for 10 years, buildings say 30 years. So in other words, they give up their value to the commodities produced over more than one production cycle or one period. Now, by convention, our production period is 1 year. This has got a, what's the word, a biological or physical basis, and certainly in agriculture, many crops are produced on an annual basis, but that's not true by definition. Even in agriculture, you quite often get 2 or 3 crops in a year, and certainly in manufacturing industry, you know, you can have a cycle of production which lasts 5 weeks or 5 years. Okay, so there's a portion of fixed capital that gets passed over to the commodity product during each production cycle. So for example, if machines last 10 years, then every year on a sort of a linear basis, 1/10 of their value gets passed over to the commodity product in the labor process. So that's the way in which fixed capital melts into the circulation of the commodities. So that's the first big concept that Marx takes into volume 3 from volume 2. The second big concept is related to that one, is turnover time. So Marx is saying depending on the industry, it will take a certain amount of time to produce commodities, sell them, get the money for that sale, and then have it available to reinvest in a new cycle of production. So that's the turnover time, is the period that it takes capital to produce and sell commodities. And in particular, what we're looking at is the turnover of the money capital. You could actually take any point in this cycle and say, okay, well, how long does it take for us to get back to this point? To try and make this a bit clearer, to give it bodily form, if you think of different production sectors in Marx's time, locomotives might take 3 years to produce. I mean, you can't produce a locomotive in 2 weeks. It takes quite a long time to put all the bits together. Okay, so the turnover time before you can produce and sell your locomotive would be of the order, let's say, of 3 years. Whereas by contrast, spinning and weaving were heavily sort of centers of the Industrial Revolution. Their products could be produced very quickly, reach